Hi, everyone. Welcome to Satire Can Save Us All. This is the webcast where we talk about cartooning and satire around the globe in the era of coronavirus. And this episode is a very special one. We're going to be celebrating one of the greatest artists ever to pick up a pen or a brush, Jeff MacNelly, who passed away 20 years ago this month here in Baltimore. And for this episode, I talked to people who knew him, were inspired by him, who work with him, and who live with him. And all bandy around the word for both his work and this person of genius. And I also thought, now that cartoons are under siege both economically and technologically, that this would be a great time for us to see how cartoons can be done to their fullest when in the hands of a master. Jeff MacNelly was born in 1947 in New York City. He went to high school at Phillips Academy in Massachusetts, where he showed great interest in drawing and illustration. He then went to the University of North Carolina, where upon graduation, took a job at the Richmond News Leader, and at the young age of 25, won the first of his 3 Pulitzer Prizes. 5 years later, in 1977, he launched his enormously successful comic strip, Shoe. At one point, it had nearly 1,000 subscribers around the US and the world. At the same time, he was also doing a syndicated panel called Pluggers, and was an illustrator for the humorist columnist Dave Barry on a regular basis. I talked to Cullum Rogers, a cartoonist and historian, to tell us a little bit more about his early years in North Carolina.
Wants about that. And what he said was he came down from Andover. The only reason he went to Chapel Hill was because he didn't get into Yale, according to Jeff. It would be interesting to see what would happen if Gary Trudeau, class of 70, and Jeff MacNelly, class of 69, had been in Yale at the same time, but they weren't. And but according to him, once one of the guys sitting next to him when he was filling out college applications at prep school said, "Put down Chapel Hill. Everybody else is." I guess for a third choice or something. And he ended up there, but he discovered the Daily Tar Heel, started drawing sports cartoons for them, shifted over sometime during his sophomore or junior year to the Chapel Hill Weekly, which was the local paper. For a while it was locally owned, then it was, and began freelancing for them and sort of became a staffer. And that was where he got his Virginia experience when he went to the Richmond News Leader in 70 or 71. I think it was 70. He went to Richmond. So he was basically cartooning in Chapel Hill for the last part of the 60s.
And it's funny because he goes to Richmond as a young guy and almost immediately wins a Pulitzer Prize, right?
It's amazing. I mean, but he had developed. I've seen some of his very early cartoons, and really for maybe a couple of months at the very beginning, his work, quote, didn't look like MacNelly cartoons, unquote. But that was it. Within a few months, he looked like Jeff MacNelly. It wasn't as polished as it became. It wasn't as detailed, but he was drawing MacNelly-type cartoons very early.
So how would you describe a MacNelly-type cartoon?
Basically, it is the theatrical quality instead of cinematic. It is not the old, it is a stage. Oliphant, the Canadian, English language Canadian cartoonist, and MacNelly all operated in that horizontal format that started coming in to replace the Herblock style vertical format we had for years. The Herblock style, I mean, they're called, portrait view and landscape view for a very good reason. And really, the portrait view is best for doing close-ups of an individual human being you want to do whatever you want to do in your political cartoon with, probably knock the stuffing out of them. Whereas the horizontal view is much better for a theatrical type scene where you are showing a group of people in relation to each other. People in relation to each other just works better horizontally because they don't stand on top of each other, they stand beside each other. I think it's as simple as that. But by putting that in, it became much more of a scene you could view and work around with instead of one big image that just hit you immediately with one impact. And I think that was sort of the main, the newer cartoonist of the MacNelly, Oliphant, Mike Peters, Tony Auth, Dwayne Powell, all that era were more into doing something funny that had a message in it, as opposed to just hitting you with the message per se.
Right.
I think.
Yeah, and his didn't he also had kind of a very personal decorative style, free flowing because of the use of brush work. But it sounded like I remember you mentioning to me that a lot of his visual cues were cast during his time in North Carolina, where you live.
Right. He came down here. He said he'd never been in the South before he came down to UNC to school in 1965. And what he said to me was, I just fell in love with the place. He fell in love with what it looked like. He liked the old country stores. Obviously, old country stores are a regular thing in MacNelly cartoons. The rusted car in the yard, the dog on the porch, that whole sort of rural South cliche imagery was one of the things he seized on and worked with. And you can see that in a lot of his, especially 1970s cartoons. Even when he's doing cartoons about presidential elections and things, if he's got two people talking about the candidates, they're probably going to be sitting on the front porch of an old North Carolina country store with the Merita bread logo on the screen door and the Coca-Cola logos on top on the sign.
Now, he also was a conservative cartoonist in a profession and at a time when there wasn't as many conservative voices in the media.
Well, he was a conservative cartoonist in those when he started out. Of course, in the 70s, there were still many of the almost all of the cartoonists who were big in the 50s and early 60s who were still working, and even some from the 40s, and more of them were conservative than I think are now. Of course, these days the meaning of conservative has changed so much. Would MacNelly be a Donald Trump conservative if he was alive today? I find that hard to believe. But I also find it hard to believe that he would have joined the Democrats to any great degree. So he just might have been out there bomb throwing like cartoonists do. He was very definitely of the older conservative generation, though his father had a high position on Goldwater's campaign. I remember him saying his father was one of the last publishers of the Saturday Evening Post while it was still a weekly, and became a portrait painter. But he worked and MacNelly got some of his political interest, I think, through his father, and also some of the art interest.
And what about that? Because he was also he was a gifted artist. There's no doubt. People talk about the fluidity of his line, and actually sit there and watch him work was amazing because he just was putting out perfect work without any sketches or anything. He just seemed to magically appear from his hand.
That facility was just amazing. He had the same kind of quality mentally. I mean, Jeff is one of the few people I've actually ever had an extended conversation with who struck me as being a genius, simply because he would just, in the course of talking about something else, just throw out some reference that most cartoonists would kill for. Just to, he referred once to going to some amusement park. He forgot the name of it, Six Pack Over Texas or something like that. And, some people would sit there for 2 hours staring at the wall trying to come up with Six Pack Over Texas as a name. I know I would at some point in my career. And just the idea that somebody could throw out, six nuggets, a paragraph that you could take and build a cartoon out of. And that's just in conversation. So when he sat down and actually started thinking about something to do a cartoon out of, the depth of stuff was amazing. He had a huge ability to come up with something that other people wish they had come up with because it seems obvious once he thought of it, but nobody else thought of it before.
That's right. Now we're going to take you from North Carolina out to Seattle, where I talked to Dave Horsey, the two-time Pulitzer Prize-winning cartoonist for the Seattle Times, and he tells us a little bit of his reflections about Jeff MacNelly.
And I was born just 4 years later than Jeff MacNelly, but by the time I made my jump into political cartooning from political reporting, he'd already won 2 Pulitzers. I quickly learned what an imposing presence he was in the world of cartooning. I mean that both literally and figuratively. He was a tall guy, and he had this massive thatch of graying hair and a chin built for Mount Rushmore. And it may seem weird using the word gravitas to describe a cartoonist because, we're all just a bunch of jokers who spend our lives doodling in a corner, but Jeff had gravitas. When he walked into a gathering of other cartoonists, he was instantly the center of attention, admiration, envy. And it wasn't because he was full of himself, because he wasn't. He was a genuinely nice guy. It was because he was so universally admired. You know, there's this term that was current in those days, MacNelly clone, and that was a serious descriptive of all these young aspiring cartoonists who tried to copy his style. I tried to avoid that myself, but I do think his influence showed up in some of my best cartoons. That's because he exemplified mastery of all the elements that go into a good editorial cartoon. Those elements that every one of us tries to master. His artwork was superb and visually very pleasing. He could caricature inanimate objects better than anybody. And you could see the influences he drew from, like, you know, Walt Kelly's cartoon strip Pogo, Mad Magazine, and that other great master, Pat Oliphant. But MacNelly's style became entirely his own. He was truly a genius at finding the right visual metaphor. He was also the funniest conservative cartoonist anyone had ever seen. And he put all those elements together to make serious political statements, which is ultimately the whole point of our craft. You know, when Jeff died 20 years ago, I drew a cartoon in tribute to him, and the process of doing that cartoon was almost a little eerie. I was trying to completely emulate his style. And as I worked with the brush and ink, I felt my fingers move differently. My hand responded in a way that was not the hand I was used to. It felt very much like I was communing with one of the great artists of our era, which I guess I was. I only wish he were still here today. I'd love to see MacNelly apply his talents and his sane conservatism to Donald Trump. Jeff, you left us way too soon.
There's probably no cartoonist today who's more intimate with the work of Jeff MacNelly than Gary Brookins. He started his career also at a newspaper in Richmond, sitting almost right next to Jeff MacNelly, and then years later, he would be helping Jeff in his big projects. I talked to Gary just earlier this week.
I was at the morning Richmond Times-Dispatch, and Jeff was at the afternoon News Leader. And I can tell you, it's pretty darn intimidating going into that situation. The first day you're going to draw a cartoon, and Jeff MacNelly is the afternoon cartoonist. But he was just so very welcoming to me and encouraging and a great friend. So this was in 1979. And so we overlapped in Richmond for 3 or 4 years before he moved on to Chicago. But I used to go in and just marvel at his draftsmanship and how he inked. And so I learned a lot of my inking from him. And a number of years later, when he was drawing pluggers, I love pluggers also. And his son Jake was killed in a rock climbing accident. So Jeff no longer wanted to do pluggers because Jake was helping him with a lot of the artwork. So anyway, he found out I was interested, and so he turned it over to me, and I did it for a year or two, and then he decided he was going to devote more time to painting and sculpting, which he was just, there's nothing the man couldn't do visually. And so he asked me to start doing the shoe dailies. He was going to continue doing the Sundays. And so I began. That was around 1999. And then, of course, short time later, he was diagnosed with lymphoma. And so
Jeff MacNelly certainly was an incredibly prolific cartoonist. Now we have a story from one of his friends, Mike Peters, who regales us with a time that he spent with him in New York City.
We had gone to New York to go to the Democratic Convention. And so Jeff and I, we were in the same hotel. We walked across the street to Madison Square Garden to where the convention was. And so going from our hotel across the street to get to the Madison Square Garden was this mishmash of stuff. You had everybody was yelling at each other. You had the cab drivers were yelling. You had guys were walking around in costumes. One guy was Abe Lincoln working on stilts, and he's walking around. And then you had nuns yelling at the cab drivers, and the cab drivers yelling, and the cops, and they had big police guard things, but we had tickets, and so we were able to walk across. Well, it took us about 20 minutes to get across the street to where the Madison Square Garden was. And so we got down in chairs and listening to it, and I'm trying to write down anything I can to come up with a cartoon idea. And he's kind of he's just sitting there looking at everything, and finally we both went across back to our hotel. He said, "I'll see you tomorrow morning." He said, "Okay." And so I sat down and did up this very, not a very good cartoon about Carter at the time. And both met in the elevator coming back down the next morning. And he had done this montage of not the convention, but crossing the street with the Lincoln and the cab drivers and the cops and the nuns, and he did everything because he saw that the real story was outside. The real story was not going on in the convention, which is really dull. It was outside with all the stuff going on, and he did a page full of these things all together of what was going on in the street. And that's when I realized, holy shit. See, I'm just a cartoonist. He is something into himself.
Jeff MacNelly certainly was something else. Someone with great insight into his creativity was his wife, Susie MacNelly. She tells me a little bit about his creative process.
His process was great. He would look like he was doing nothing. He would look like he was sitting, leaning back, picking his feet, for instance. And that's the most intense time for him. And then he would get the idea, and he could talk to people while he was drawing. And he was a fast draftsman. He always had the TV on, and he was, there were movies. But he said he hadn't seen every single movie made, but he'd heard it. He was busy drawing it. But yeah.
Now, Jeff wasn't just a great artist, but he also was a great colleague. Here we have some words from Dave Barry, the award-winning humor columnist, about his time with Jeff.
I'm Dave Barry. Jeff MacNelly illustrated my syndicated newspaper column for years. And he was my good friend. Not only was Jeff unbelievably talented as a cartoonist, as everyone knows, but he was really funny. I guess that goes without saying, and really easy to work with. Sometimes I'd be running kind of late on a column, and Jeff would need to know what to draw. And he'd call me up, and the conversation would go something like, I'd go, "I'm not sure, but I think it's going to be dogs." And Jeff would go, "Okay." And he'd draw a brilliant cartoon about dogs. Or I'd say, "It's okay, it's about a guy, and he was taking a dump, and there was a snake in the toilet, and it bit him on the balls." And Jeff would go like, "What kind of snake?" And I go, "I think it was a cobra." And he'd go, "Okay." And he would draw a great cartoon. So you could not have asked for a better friend or a better collaborator. He was wonderful. There was nobody like him. And I miss the guy every single day.
Jeff was a great artist. He was a great colleague, but he also could be a little eccentric, as his wife Susie points out here.
Fishhawk's desk.
Right. He didn't believe in files, because he thought if you put it in a file and it was in a drawer, you would never see it again. So he was like Bill Marlin. He had this, chronological pile of stuff everywhere.
And he knew where everything was.
And he knew where it was.
We already know that Jeff was a great artist, great colleague. But one element that everyone agreed on was his kindness. Mike Peters again with a fun story.
One time we were at a restaurant, and it was in Dayton, and this one girl said, could I have a cartoon? He said, of course. And he got a napkin, and he started drawing, and he drew Shoe, and then he drew Shoe sitting at a desk, and then he started drawing the whole tree that Shoe was sitting at, and then he kept drawing, I mean, all the way down to where the roots of the tree were and stuff, and by the time he got done, I mean, he was talking and we were having a nice conversation, but when he got done, he had a masterpiece that he had been drawing for this girl, and then he signed it in the here, and she would go, oh my God, I can't believe it. Well, thank you. You know,
Jeff MacNelly wasn't just kind to strangers. He also showed great generosity to young aspiring cartoonists. Here's Matt Davies, the fantastic cartoonist for Newsday, about his first meeting with Jeff MacNelly when he was invited to join them for dinner.
Hey, listen, why don't you come join us for dinner? You and Lucy come join us for dinner. Jeff MacNelly and his wife Susie are going to come to my place and we're going to have dinner. And I was like, that was like saying like, oh, like Bono or Sting or David Bowie or something was coming to dinner. I was like, Jeff MacNelly. And so, of course, I was really nervous the whole drive from Fort Lauderdale to Boca for that. And when I met him, and when we met him, he was so gracious, and he knew my work, and he said nice things about it, which was probably lies, but no, he was just so down to earth, and we sat around and we had dinner and we put away a lot of wine, and he said so many things about cartooning, and he gave me so much advice, and he was so just magnanimous, and that I couldn't believe I walked in feeling like I was meeting my hero, and I left being friends with him, and he said we left at like 2 o'clock in the morning, and he said, hey, come back and join us for breakfast, 10 o'clock. So we did. We came back, and we had pancakes and hung out, and we had a really nice time. But he gave me so much good advice about cartooning that I still use to this day. One being, anytime he said, anytime you feel like you're doing well, you're doing good, he's like, check yourself, because that's when you're probably not. And that definitely resonates even now. You don't ever want to actually think that you're doing pretty good work. You should always be challenging yourself. And then finally, when we left, he said, "Here's my phone number," and he wrote his phone number down on it, and I still have it in his pen, in his handwriting, and it says Blue Ridge Towing and Salvage, and then his phone number, and we remained friends ever since then. So, but what an amazing guy, and I still can't believe it's been 20 years since he was gone.
While putting together this episode, pretty much everyone I talked to mentioned the word genius. They talked about his great artwork, of course, but all of them also described that being in his presence was really something special. I think it was probably summed up most accurately by his wife, Susie.
He wasn't from here. I always say, on his home planet, there were others like him.
Well, how would you like Jeff to be remembered?
Just as a nice guy who just happened to be a genius.